Okay, we're going to finish this module with the Hebrews and early Christian. So this module is on the Roman Empire and then these two faiths and what happened. How did they begin? What is their history? And then what happened to them during the ancient periods. So what I did was I included this. I love timelines because this is a way for you to really organize your thinking about what happened. Now, you notice it says right here, philosophy, religion, and science. So this talks about those significant changes. And over here, you've got literature and music, which we're not focusing on yet. So when you look at this, you can see that Akhenaten right here, first monotheistic pharaoh, and then here right behind him you have Moses and the Exodus, and that of course is Hebrew history. And then you go along down the timeline 1,000 years later, and here's the earliest Hebrew Psalms. That's around 1000 BC, before Christ, of course. And then here you have, here's Cicero, Ovid. Then around here, 0, you're looking at the golden age of Rome. Here, around 300, you're looking at the Greeks that we talked about with Sophocles. This is the drama. And here you have the execution, early like 400s of Socrates. And so here, 0, now we're going AD, this is the crucifixion of Christ. And then over here, now look at this. This is what you just talked about. And so this is the Roman Empire in 300 to 200s when you have these philosophies, Stoicism, Epicureanism, Cynicism. So I think these are really good for you to put that timeline in order to see, well, what came first, the chicken or the egg? And then here is the politics and the art and the architecture. So here again you have, we're going to talk about Jewish history, the monarchy of David. Here you have a Hellenistic age. And this is the Babylonian captivity of the Hebrews. And then here's Alexander. Here's the Hellenistic age. There's the those are the Greeks. End of the Roman Empire in the West, around 400. We're going to talk about that, 476, and that's also when the Western early Christian, as well as the Western Roman Empire, falls to the barbarians. So here you've got your Parthenon right here, okay? Here's Trajan's column. And then here, you can't see it because I'm blocking it, is the first, Old St. Peter's is the first church, and that's early Christian period, and Old St. Peter's is, Good Shepherd, those is early Christian, and that's during the period of recognition, but the period of persecution comes first. So we're looking at the Hebrews first, and just doing a quick sort of overview. I don't know how much you know about the Hebrews, but except that the Old Testament is from the Hebrews, and the New Testament, of course, is Christian. So, see, the Hebrews are very interesting because they have a view of God and the individual that's different than we've been looking at before. And they believe in monotheism and a personal universal God. Okay? That's very different than all these, the Romans had many gods, the Sumerians, the Greeks. So, except for Akhenaten, that one Egyptian pharaoh. And Zoroastrianism, we looked at that, sort of alluded to that as well. So this actually is very significant. And so we'll talk about the 10 Commandments when we look at Jewish history. I'm going to say the Hebrews are the Jews, so I'm going to like use them interchangeably, okay? But like, who were these people? Well, they were from Mesopotamia, of course. And they migrate to this region later called Palestine, which is north of the Jordan River. And so they were nomadic, like, pretty much everybody else, and then settled in this region. And they have their founding fathers, which we'll talk about momentarily, which is Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So Abraham is the founding father of not only the Hebrews, but also Islam, okay? So the Hebrews, the Hebrews are the Jews, and they are culture, and they are also faith. So they're also known as the Israelites. And early on, they were called the Semites, and then became the Israelites. And so in that book, the Tanakh, which is the Old Testament, you're going to see a flood story, as you know, the creation story, Garden of Eden. All these are similar to Mesopotamian sources. And also in Exodus, in the Old Testament, some of the things that are in the Code of Hammurabi are in Exodus. One example is an eye for an eye. That is in both in the Code of Hammurabi and Exodus. And and the Code of Hammurabi is earlier. Alrighty. Now, the Hebrews break their history up into really three significant parts. The first period is the founding fathers. We'll talk about all three of these. And then their captivity in Egypt and their exodus, their flight from Egypt. And then they talk about, the period of the kings. And so the period of founding fathers begins with Abraham, because he's the founder of the Hebrew tradition and faith. And he establishes this idea of monotheism, which is to worship one God. And it is unlike other gods because it is a personal God. And there is two covenants that take place with the Hebrews. A covenant is an agreement. And the first agreement occurs between God and Abraham to lead the Hebrew clan or tribe to a new land and build a nation. And in return, the Hebrews would have trust and faith in God. That was the first covenant. And in the period of the founding fathers, you have Abraham, his son Isaac, and Isaac's son Jacob. So then you have this second period in their history, which is captivity and exodus from Egypt. So while in Egypt, the Hebrews became enslaved. But there is an exodus, and Moses leads them out of Egypt to Mount Sinai. Now, there's a problem, because Moses goes up in the mountain and he leaves his people for a long period of time. And as you know, you've seen the movies or the movie history, they get very nervous and they're afraid. And so they build this golden calf because they're afraid. And so Moses comes down the mountain and he breaks those tablets that have God has given him the 10 Commandments. And so because that happened, God had said the Jews are the chosen people. He delivers the 10 Commandments. Then Moses comes back down the mountain, and the Hebrews are just, afraid, and they're create this golden calf. And so there has to be a second covenant. I take that back. I'm sorry, I got that confused. The second covenant was when he was on the mountain, and that's when Yahweh, God, says he will intervene in history in the course of events, and he will lead these people. And that's when Moses comes down off the mountain after this wonderful experience and finds all the Hebrews like are out of control in the golden calf. And so, then they have to wander. So then they have to wander for 40 years in the desert, where generations, of course, die. So finally, they do get to the period, the region we call Israel, and we're going to look at that in a minute. But they actually have, in the period of their kings, their first king is Saul after 40 years of wandering, and he's going to unite the 12 Hebrew tribes. They're originally from the Aegean Sea area and the coast of Asia Minor, but he's going to unite all these tribes. And then it's during the reign of David that, see, everything is oral, just like with the Greeks. Everything is oral. And then they start recording. With the Sumerians, then they start recording. So they begin recording their holy scriptures. And it is called the Old Testament by Christians. And it's their book of the Tanakh, which is also, a part of it is called the Torah. And you should know that the Tanakh and the Torah are not books. They're actually on a scroll, 2 scrolls. So it's not a book. Lastly, King Solomon is when their literature is completed, and he builds a palace in Jerusalem and a temple next to it, and they begin to prosper. But then, like all civilizations in this area, they're going to fall. And so this is the beginning. You see, you've got Israel and Judea. You've got northern part, you've got the southern part. The northern part is Israel, the southern part is Judea. And so they just sort of split. And because there's some favoritism going on. So after the death of Solomon, and we're talking around, I'm just going to round it off 1000 BC, because of the heavy taxes of Solomon and his favored treatment of the Judea, they split into these north and southern tribe. Now, we already looked at this, and they had conquered the Philistines to get this area. And so, of course, this is the area that's in, a lot of politics and warring going on today. And so this is very similar to the Mycenaeans, because the kings started fighting with each other, and then they're conquered. So this is what's going to happen here, and this is how the history goes. In 722 BC, the northern region conquers, of course, too, the Assyrians. And so they have their own diaspora when this all takes place, the Jews. And so 586, then the southern region is conquered by the Babylonians. So this is the Hebrew or Jewish diaspora, just like the African diaspora, when the Africans were taken as slaves and taken from their country and spread out, taken into Western regions. This is the Jewish diaspora when they are removed from their home and just, moved to all these different regions. But they continue to practice their faith. And this is what happens. They're in exile, but they still continue to practice their faith. And so the Persians conquer the Babylonians, and then the Jews are set free, and some do go back to Judea. And they build a second temple. So by the 2nd century, they have their independence again. Then they're conquered by the Romans, and the temple is destroyed. The second temple. So that's what's happening over there today with that sacred that sacred land in Israel. The temple, the dome was built, and that's what's in discrepancy, whose land that is. Because the Palestinians, home staked their homeland there, but then the Israelites or the Jews, the Hebrews, wanted it back because that's where their temple was. Okay. So this is their holy scriptures, and the Tanakh and the Torah. And the Torah has Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus. And this is, of course, the Old Testament. Okay, now, this is what is significant about the Hebrews compared to the ancient Near East at this time is this idea of an all-knowing, all-omnipotent, all-powerful God, one God. Is eternal, no realm before him, has superior will, created and governs the world. God is above nature. He's not a part of nature. He's transcendental. Where, with the Greeks, Neptune, he was under this, everybody was human-like, as well as with the Romans. They didn't have this idea of a God that was beyond what they could see. So they contextualize it. The Romans and the Greeks, their gods, as well, they must be sort of look like us. So this is pretty important, above nature. So as compared to over here, ancient Near East, many gods, gods come and go. You've got to give the gods water and give them food, their shrines they build. And so that's the big difference. So, students, that's like very important. Okay. And so I wanted to show the difference between Judaism, the Hebrew faith, and Christianity, because the Jews do not believe that Jesus is the Son of God, but that Jesus is a prophet. And so does Islam. So where Christians believe in one God in the Trinity. And in Christianity, you're defined by this transformation that takes place of spirituality in the next life. And I think the Jews focus on today, the deeds. You are defined by your actions and your deeds, and those laws are in the Torah. And so that is not to say in Christianity that, living the right way is not important, but it's still different in the sense that there's this transformation that's going to happen. And so the Christians believe in heaven and hell, and the Jews don't really think about it that way. They don't think about it in the same way Christians do. Their afterlife is very different. The narrative is not the same, because it's so transcendental that you can't imagine it. Now, this is important because the Jews they have no images, no graven images, just like Islam, just like the Muslims. They don't have images of people. Where Christians, lots of images of people and stories. So Jews have temples, Beth Israel Temple in Fayetteville, and then, of course, Christians have churches. And we're going to look at the first Christian church. Okay? So, these are just for you to look at some of their dates or their holidays. Passover, when that happens, what is Passover? And it's commemorating the Exodus from Egypt. Feast of Weeks is honoring when Moses received the Ten Commandments. Messiah means the anointed one who has not arrived. And so they believe the anointed one has not arrived yet, where Christians believe that Jesus is the anointed one. Forget this, write an overview. That's from not an online class, but you know they have in the Old Testament the book of Psalms, which is lyric poetry. You have meditation poetry, like the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. That is seen as meditation poetry. Then you have Song of Solomon, which is sort of sensuous in nature. And then you have Proverbs, writing about wisdom. And the book of Job deals with the nature of God and humans. So that's sort of an overview of the Old Testament. And then we move to early Christian. Okay. So as you can see, early Christian has a sculpture. That's the title is The Good Shepherd. So there's no images to show you with the Hebrews because they're aniconic, which means no images. Okay? So what happens with early Christian? Well, a Palestinian Jew named Jesus is executed by the Roman authorities. All right? His teaching is rooted in the Torah, later called the Old Testament. So without the Jews, there would be no Christianity. So what happens? Well, these are the four Jewish sects: the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the Essenes, and the Zealots. And we're going to look at those. It's believed that Jesus was an Essene because they were the most liberal of the Jewish sects or groups. So the Sadducees is the upper stratum of Jewish society, and they control the temple. This is where they had problems with Christ, with Jesus, because he was liberal, and this is a very strict. They are like the Orthodox Jews today. The Jews today have different levels of strictness. So the Orthodox Jews are very strict, and they're the ones that wear black, the guys, and they have the tendril of the hair, and wear black and a black hat, and they wear like a bib kind of cloth here with strings. So that's the most Orthodox. Very, very, very strict. And very, very conservative. And the Sadducees insisted on the rigid rules of the temple and the ceremonies. And so they interpret everything, the Torah, literally. Okay? Where the Pharisees, they're a little more liberal. Believe in life after death, and the Pharisees have the support of most of the Jewish people. Whereas the Essenes see the Sadducees as corrupt, and they're only taking care of themselves. And it is speculated that Jesus may have been an Essenes, because the Essenes, those Hebrews believed in the physical resurrection of the body. So you see how this is all sort of woven in there together. And then you've got the Zealots, which are saying, hey, don't pay taxes to Rome. Don't acknowledge the authority of Rome, because they're activists. And of course, they are crushed by the Romans. Well, you know, Jesus didn't write anything. What is written comes later. Everything in the New Testament, and that is early Christian, is written 10 decades after his death. But see, what happened was, Jesus was very distressed with, he was Jewish, but he was very distressed with what was happening with the Sadducees and the cruelty. And so, his focus is on this inner being, a moral transformation of the individual and the spirit, and, to be kind and to be generous and to share, to be a Christian. Well, remember that this is during the Roman Empire, and we have to look at this. And we talked about the Romans, but, you know, there's a period of persecution and a period of recognition with the early Christians. And so here's that Roman Empire again. And you know, you did have, um, first of all, they're always trying to be conquered by different groups, barbarian groups, but also Spartacus led a rebellion of the slaves. And, you know, slaves found Christianity to be very attractive. Why? Because it was, you know, not kill people, take care of people, help each other. So, of course, it was very attractive, considering what the Romans were doing. And so you have two periods in early Christian. This is the period of persecution. This is 33 AD. Christ dies to 300 years of persecution. This is when you're finding yourself in, and I'll show you some images, you're under Rome hiding out because you're going to be persecuted by being burned alive, hung, thrown to the lions. And then you have a period of recognition. And we talked about that with the Romans because Constantine converts to Christianity. Then you have the period of recognition. And they built the first church. Mm-hmm. So this is that horrible period of persecution when emperors, look, 64 to 311, when emperors are treating Christians, they're torturing them, they're mutilating them, they're starving them, they're burning them, they're putting them in the gladiator games for amusement. But now Constantine's father, before Constantine, he was doing this to the Christians, but it's Constantine who converted. By the way, he converted, it was like really, I mean, okay, it was, part of that was the politics of converting. So during the period of persecution, this is when their Christians are underground in catacombs like this, that the tunnels they bury, they meet down there. You may see a fresco painted on a wall or a surface. It's dark and smelly because these are where they put the bodies of the dead, the Christian dead. So down in these chambers. So you're not going to have you're not going to be spending a lot of time down there creating images on the wall. And you can visit these catacombs today. But period of recognition, yay, you can be public about your faith. So here's a sculpture. You've seen sculpture before. So if you know that it could be anybody, right? There's a kid, and he's got a lamb on his shoulder. Well, this is the Good Shepherd. Everything early Christians made is their subject is religious. That makes sense. Okay? So the one piece of architecture that we have, and we're going to end with, is the first church in Rome called Old St. Peter's. Now it was built, burned down, it was rebuilt several times. And so this is actually very important because it's going to be the blueprint, the floor plan for the medieval cathedrals that we're going to briefly look at. And you've already seen some of this because this right here, this rectangular floor plan right here, that's a basilica. That's the same as the Greek temple, the Parthenon. Okay, that is, basilica is the rectangular floor plan. This right here, this courtyard is called an atrium. An atrium is in the mall in the center where you have those lights coming in and you have those benches. I think there's a fountain, I'm not sure. So that's the courtyard, and it's not the food court. This is a courtyard. It's called an atrium. So here it may be if you're Christian, and I don't know, and if you're affiliated with a church, then let's just say this is your church, and you're going to go into that church, and the first thing you're going to walk in is you're going to say, well, that's the aisle, because you walk into the center, and then you have your seats on either side, your benches or your pews. Actually, that's the nave. The center aisle of a church is the nave. The aisles are on the outside. next to the wall. Your pews are here, next to the wall. That's your aisle. Now, in a great cathedral, those naves and central aisles are going to be huge, monumental. They're not going to be like narrow, like a modest church. So then you've got this right here. This right here, this is a transept where this transept intersects with this, which is the nave. Right into where it intersects is where you have your apse. That's called an apse. And that is where the pulpit would be in your apse. Okay? So this is a blueprint for early churches, and like the pulpit used to be in the center. Now I see it's off more to one side or the other. But when you see the rise of cathedrals in the medieval, you're going to see how we're going to take this blueprint and it's going to be magnificent. So that's where we end, but I close with just sort of this overview of what happens. So you see the Hebrews were conquered, enslaved and conquered, and then diaspora. Well, that's what's going to happen to early Christians when Rome falls. When the early Christian and the western front of the Roman Empire in Europe falls, that's what happens. But, and we're going to look at this next, the Byzantine Empire is the Eastern Orthodox Christianity that Constantine set up. So that continued. Where the West falls to the barbarians. So just two names that, are important. St. Paul, an effective missionary, he wrote more than a quarter of the New Testament. And he's responsible for translating Christianity because it's Greco-Roman culture. So he's translating it into ways that people can understand it. And so in the West, they spoke Latin, like where the Pope is, Latin. But when in the East, in Byzantium or Constantine, the Eastern Orthodox Christian Empire, that's Greek. It's Greek Orthodox Christianity. And we have a Greek Orthodox church in Fayetteville near the school here. So, and then there's St. Augustine, because this is important because he is the first Roman that converted and marks that transition from antiquity to Christianity. And so now this is very interesting because he writes his autobiography entitled Confessions. He writes about that conversion. And okay, look at it this way. How do you take something like Roman, many gods, Christian, one gods, this, belief system in very different than the Romans? How do you interpret that? And he does it through Platonism and Cicero. You see how that works? Which because Plato, as I showed you, he talked about that third realm that we don't even imagine. We try and get to the second. I mean, we don't try and get to be like God. We try to get to be good people, right? Where there's truth and justice. But we live in this changing world of ideas, and appetite topples reason. So that's how he does it. And also the writing of Cicero. And you looked at some of those things. So as you can see now, all this sort of tedious information really comes together. And you can see how we are Sumerians, we are Egyptians, we are Romans, we are Hebrews, we are all these things as humankind that's come together to make us a belief system in what we believe and in our politics and everything else. So that's where I'm going to end, and that's it for this module.